Today, we're celebrating my daughter's new home.
Mom, you have to come no matter what, okay?
Her serious tone when she said this has been on my mind, but today, I just want to focus on celebrating. However, when I arrived late, my husband, Mark, and my mother-in-law, Florence, completely ignored me. I could understand Florence behaving this way, but for Mark to ignore me too. What's going on? Feeling uncomfortable, I pretended to admire the backyard and stepped outside. There, my granddaughter, Emma, who was playing in the yard, spotted me and ran over with a big smile.
Grandma, well,
She seemed like she wanted to say something but hesitated. I tilted my head, puzzled, and Emma finally blurted out her words as if summoning her courage. What a shock! Hearing the reason why Mark and Florence were ignoring me, I quietly disappeared. After a while, Mark called me on my phone. Usually calm and composed, he was almost hysterical, yelling at the top of his lungs.
What were you thinking?
It's time to settle this, once and for all, 30 years in the making. My carefully orchestrated plan for revenge was now in motion. My name is Kate Evans. I'm a 51-year-old homemaker who has worked at the same company for 30 years since graduating from a local community college. I once dreamed of being a stay-at-home mom, but life didn't allow it. 30 years ago, when I had just turned 20, a marriage proposal came my way. A loyal customer at the family restaurant my parents ran wanted me to marry into their family. I was quite familiar with that family. They were the picture-perfect image of refined wealth, the kind that stood out even in this small town. Since high school, I had been helping out at my family's restaurant, always admiring them from afar. The wife was tall, elegant, and beautiful, like a model. The husband was an elite professional working for a major corporation. And their son, who clearly inherited the best traits of both parents, exuded a sense of privilege and good upbringing at first glance. I was chosen to be his bride. At the time, I was a perfectly ordinary office worker who had just graduated from a local community college, so the proposal was almost too unbelievable. Even when I was invited to their home later and confirmed it was true, it still felt like a dream.
I've always admired how cheerful and hardworking you are at the restaurant, Kate.
Hearing that from someone I had always looked up to made me genuinely glad that I'd taken my work seriously. When we were alone, Mark confided in me. I don't want someone flashy like my mom. I want a modest woman like you to help me build a stable family. Mark, 10 years my senior, was already a supervisor at a company owned by his paternal uncle. He was charming, kind, and everything I could have hoped for, frankly, more than I deserved. Up until then, my only experiences with dating had been splitting the bill with guys my age, so Mark's gentlemanly manners left me absolutely over the moon.
All I ask is that you come as you are, Kate.
With Florence's encouragement, I married into this wonderful family, filled with nothing but dreams of becoming one of them. But that fantasy was shattered almost immediately. 3 months after we tied the knot and began our married life.
My husband's mother needs care now, so we've decided to have her move in with us. Kate, you have a caregiver's license, don't you?
Well, I have a license for administrative work and caregiving, but
What?
I wasn't sure who had told her what, but it became clear that Florence had misunderstood, believing I was qualified to work directly in caregiving. I quickly realized that her motivation for welcoming me into the family was as a caregiver. I knew something felt off. It was far too good of an offer for someone as unremarkable as me. I could see Florence's once kind expression turning strained. Am I about to be thrown out of the house? A tense silence fell between us. Breaking the awkward air, Mark stepped in.
Mom, I never married Kate to make her do that. Grandma's care is our family's responsibility. What are you going to do if Kate decides to leave because of this?
But
I may not have the qualifications, but I'm happy to help in any way I can. I was deeply moved that Mark stood up for me. Though my words were impulsive, I genuinely felt, in that moment, a desire to make an effort as part of the family. In truth, back at my parents' home, there was a time when my grandmother suffered from dementia. My mom was her primary caregiver, and I often helped out as well. For some reason, I just couldn't bring myself to say it. My father-in-law, Kevin, was the third son, and as far as I knew, his mother was living with the eldest son's family. That lingering question was probably the real reason I stayed silent. Still, I thought it might be a good idea to learn some practical caregiving skills. But that turned out to be unnecessary much sooner than I expected. Not long after, Kevin passed away.
how am I supposed to live without you?
Florence cried uncontrollably, and I truly felt sorry for her. Kevin was still in his 50s. Having suddenly lost the love of her life, Florence wept throughout the entire wake, and with no one able to find the right words to comfort her, Mark gently put his arm around her shoulders and stayed by her side. Meanwhile, I was busy greeting guests and serving tea, but snippets of conversation among Kevin's relatives caught my attention. They said Florence's family had gone from being wealthy to bankrupt and fled from New York to this small town to escape their debts. Even after marrying Kevin, she constantly pressured him about money, forcing him to work tirelessly, which they believed ultimately shortened his life. They suspected that Florence's insistence on taking in her mother-in-law for caregiving was likely motivated by an inheritance. Now that Kevin was gone, they were openly discussing cutting ties with her entirely. Soon, I would learn that all of this was the truth. Mark was cut off by his father's relatives and lost his job at his uncle's company. To make matters worse, the house was under Mark's name. It had been newly built just before our marriage, leaving a substantial mortgage to pay off. On top of that, we discovered that Florence had cashed out and spent Kevin's life insurance policy. This household had been entirely supported by Kevin's income, and Florence's tearful words, "How am I supposed to live without you?" turned out to be painfully literal. Florence's reckless spending had left us without any savings, and as our worries became reality, she said to me,
Kate, from now on, I want you to contribute your entire paycheck to the household.
She claimed she would use Kevin's survivor benefits to fund her retirement, but I doubted that was the full story. Mark promised to start looking for jobs right away, but there were no guarantees about when he'd find one. At just 20 years old, I faced the harsh reality of having to shoulder the mortgage and cover the family's living expenses. Overwhelmed with anxiety, I soon discovered that I was pregnant. I worked right up until the brink of giving birth and named our baby girl Daisy. In the midst of our tough life, she was the only ray of hope. I resolved to protect her no matter what. Mark found another job, but it was poorly paid, and together with my maternity benefits, we were just barely making ends meet. Meanwhile, Florence continued to buy whatever she wanted and indulge in her favorite foods, living a life of comfort. No matter how many times Mark scolded or tried to persuade her, it was useless. Florence refused to work. She dressed up and took Daisy out, even before Daisy could hold her head up, saying, "People keep telling me I don't look like I have a grandchild." She was using Daisy to satisfy her own vanity. She left the night crying, and diaper changes entirely to me, yet monopolized Daisy the rest of the time, all while pressuring me to return to work as soon as possible. What am I even doing here? Sensing how I felt, Mark said to me,
"This is just temporary. Once things settle down, the three of us, you, me, and Daisy, will move out and start fresh."
His words gave me the push I needed. That's right, the three of us could be happy together. As long as Florence wasn't in the picture. I couldn't deny that I had started to feel that way. Under the condition that Mark, whose office was nearby, would come home if anything happened, I left Daisy in Florence's care and returned to work. I worked hard, taking on overtime and tasks with bonuses, all in hopes of achieving our dreams as soon as possible. Yet, not only were we unable to save any money, but our financial situation didn't improve at all. Florence kept taking Daisy out, buying expensive children's clothes, and then billing me, claiming I spent it for Daisy. What made it worse was her use of the family credit card Mark had set up. She knew I would pay off the bills to avoid hurting Mark's credit score. Then, Mark lost his job. He had frequently been leaving work to respond to Florence's calls, citing reasons like the diaper needs changing or Daisy won't stop crying. Even in this situation, Florence's spending habits remained unchanged. "Florence, we don't have extra money to spare." I've lost count of how many times I've said this to Florence. And every single time, she responds the same way.
Don't worry. Money goes around and comes around.
Raised as the daughter of a wealthy family, Florence had relocated to this town after her family's downfall. Her beauty had caught Kevin's eye, and until his passing, she had never experienced financial hardship. No, even now, she's the only one who hasn't experienced any financial struggles. Mark, who worked outside the home and understood the value of money, tried to make Florence face reality, but also showed signs of giving up. I could see he felt guilty toward me, and I understood his desire to leave the house. I need to save money quickly so the three of us can move out. Mark's job was still low-paying, but he managed to find work with some flexibility, and Daisy continued to grow up healthy and happy. However, she had become a complete grandma's girl, and Florence, who adored Daisy for resembling her, spoiled her endlessly. She indulged Daisy by buying her whatever she wanted and taking her out, purchasing expensive children's clothes in the process. Eventually, she began asking Mark for money to fund these habits. I refused to contribute money, citing the mortgage payments and Daisy's future education expenses as my reasons. As if in defiance, Florence seemed to flaunt her close bond with Daisy even more. Was this really okay? Daisy had become deeply attached to Florence, and I began to worry whether our dream of living as a family of three would ever come true. Eventually, when Daisy entered middle school, she started prioritizing time with her friends and naturally began to distance herself from Florence. Still, her love for her grandmother didn't change. However, by this time, Florence had stopped buying things for Daisy. Daisy had grown into a smart girl who understood that her school required specific items, and having different ones might make her stand out. Our conversations increased, and Daisy even began consulting me about her goals, like which school she wanted to attend. The idea of the three of us moving out together had naturally faded away, but things were much better than before. Daisy was accepted into a university in New York and was set to live on her own. As I was feeling overwhelmed with loneliness, Daisy said to me,
Mom, I've always known. It's thanks to all your hard work that I've gotten this far. And I love Dad and Grandma for supporting me too. I'm so glad to be part of this family.
Her words brought tears to my eyes, knowing she understood my efforts. At the same time, I believed we were a close-knit family. And why wouldn't I? We had always acted like one in front of Daisy. Even after it became just the three of us, Florence's extravagant spending and demands for money didn't stop. Still, I always had Mark on my side, supporting me no matter what. Without him, I wouldn't have been able to make it this far. In our retirement, Mark and I would live quietly together in this house, with the mortgage finally paid off. That had become my dream. About 3 years after Daisy started her career, she shared the news of her engagement. On top of that, Daisy was expecting a baby, doubling our joy. The baby was eventually born and named Emma, making me a grandmother at last. As it turns out, Daisy's husband is from the same hometown, and their connection led to their marriage. To my delight, they decided to move back to this area and build a house here. Daisy and her husband began visiting more frequently for house hunting trips, and I finally got to meet my granddaughter. I was completely smitten with the little girl who looked so much like Daisy, and for the first time, I felt like I could somewhat understand Florence's feelings. At the same time, I couldn't help but worry that Florence might go overboard with her great-grandchild fever. However, by this point, Florence had stopped bringing up money altogether. When I asked Mark about it, I discovered the truth. Mark had been secretly selling the mountain of designer goods and jewelry Florence owned and giving her the money.
She has so much, she'll never notice.
However, it seemed she was keeping track after all, as she would make a fuss over this or that being missing and then accuse me of taking it. Each time, Mark would scold and calm Florence down.
Mom, that design is way too childish for you. I'll buy you a new one.
Not realizing the money came from the sale of her own belongings, Florence would cheer up. However, Mark couldn't keep selling Florence's things indefinitely. Soon, Florence started pestering me for money again. That day, she was particularly insistent, claiming she absolutely needed money. Exhausted from work, I lost my temper and snapped. Enough already. Do you even realize whose fault this mess is? Florence was startled by my raised voice, something she had never experienced before. She turned away with a huff and stormed off to her room. Mark quickly went after her. He was surely trying to calm Florence down. Feeling that I had gone too far, I decided to apologize to Florence and went to her room, only to overhear their conversation.
Mom, you've got to handle this more carefully. Just leave it to me. If you're a little nice to them, they'll do whatever you say. That's how I've kept her in check for the past 30 years.
But Kate keeps saying she won't pay for the mortgage anymore.
The mortgage is almost paid off, so I'll have the house transferred back to my name. She'll do whatever I say, so don't worry. If you don't want her around, we can kick her out. She's nothing more than a cash cow anyway.
Mark's voice was filled with absolute confidence as he spoke. I quietly made my way downstairs, careful not to make a sound. So, this is what it feels like to be hit over the head with a blunt object. Florence wasn't my real enemy. What had these 30 years been for? Years of enduring everything, believing in Mark, and doing it all for him. I had been such a fool. A dry, bitter laugh escaped my lips. The word divorce immediately crossed my mind, but the thought of simply walking away in tears left me furious. I'll get revenge that will make Mark regret everything. The next day, I acted as if nothing had happened, going about my usual routine while secretly devising a detailed plan. Eventually, Daisy's new house was completed, and we were invited to the housewarming party. The day finally came.
Mom, you have to come no matter what, okay?
Daisy's serious tone when she said this had been on my mind, but today I resolved to celebrate with all my heart. However, when I arrived a bit late, Mark and Florence completely ignored me. I could understand Florence behaving that way, but for Mark to ignore me as well. What was going on? Feeling uncomfortable, I pretended to admire the backyard and stepped outside, where my granddaughter Emma spotted me and ran over with a big smile. I was overjoyed that she remembered me and knelt down to her height. "Emma, you've grown so much. Grandma has been looking forward to seeing you."
Grandma, well,
Emma looked like she wanted to say something, but hesitated. I tilted my head in curiosity, and then Emma seemed to gather her courage and spoke. What a shock! When I learned the reason why Mark and Florence were ignoring me, I silently slipped away. A little while later, my phone started buzzing incessantly with calls from Mark, but I ignored them and rushed home. I felt sorry for Daisy, but by now the celebration must have descended into chaos. The calls kept coming so persistently that I finally picked up, only to hear Mark, usually so calm, shouting hysterically.
What the hell are you thinking?
"What about you? What are you thinking?" I recalled what Emma had told me earlier.
Grandma, can you give Grandpa money for the hospital?
By Grandpa, Emma meant Mark. But what did she mean by hospital money? I asked Emma. "Did you overhear Grandpa talking about it? Can you tell Grandma what they said?"
Grandpa is really sick. But he's upset because Grandma won't give him any money to go to the hospital. Daddy and Mommy have been giving him money, but they said they can't anymore. So now Grandma has to give him money.
Although her words were halting, I understood the situation clearly. Mark had been lying about being ill and claiming that I was withholding hospital money, all to get financial support from Daisy and her husband. It's likely that Daisy wanted to use this gathering as an opportunity to have a serious discussion. That's probably why she insisted so strongly that I come. I'm certain she must have told Mark and Florence that their financial support would end before I arrived. That would explain the tense atmosphere when I got there. I decided to confront Mark over the phone. "I had no idea. You're seriously ill?"
Well,
There was a long silence. He was probably scrambling to figure out how I had found out. "Do you have no shame, lying about being gravely ill just to beg money from our daughter and her husband?"
well, Mom told me to do it.
Liar. Florence has always been brutally honest about what she wants. She'd never pull off something this elaborate. If she needs money, she asks for it outright. You're lying to her too, aren't you? I suspected that Florence might also have been deceived by Mark's lies. Perhaps her persistent requests for money weren't for herself, but because she had believed Mark's fabricated story. That would explain everything. Florence had been traumatized by her family's bankruptcy and their forced move out of their mansion. Whenever I mentioned not paying the mortgage, she would back down and stop pushing further. But that day, Florence had been unusually persistent.
What's wrong? This isn't like you, Kate.
Of course, he'd say that. Up until now, I had never spoken to him like this. After all, I had always been the obedient wife who did whatever she was told. Was he trying to change the subject and smooth things over?
And what's this divorce paper about? I don't get it.
Let's settle everything from the last 30 years once and for all. So Daisy must have handed him the divorce papers. After hearing what Emma told me earlier, I had hurried home, almost running, intending to pack up my things and leave. No, I didn't have many belongings to pack. The truth was, I wanted to grab the house deed before anything else. As I hurried, Daisy ran after me.
Mom, what's going on? You said you wanted to see the backyard, but then you never came back.
Well, I'll explain everything in detail later, but for now, can you give this to your dad?
This is a divorce paper.
I'm sorry to bring this up on such a happy day, but I was planning to give it to him after today's celebration. Oh, and just so you know, your dad is perfectly healthy. His last health checkup came back completely normal, so there's no doubt about it. Daisy, being the smart girl she is, seemed to grasp the situation. Mark must have received the divorce papers from Daisy and immediately called me in a panic.
Let's at least talk about this, okay? Can we do that?
Sure, but let's include a lawyer in the discussion. I'll be in touch soon. With that, I ended the call abruptly and turned off my phone. The carefully orchestrated revenge I had planned was now set in motion. A week later, I contacted Mark to inform him that we would have a discussion at the lawyer's office. Having the meeting at home would only complicate things with Florence around, and I also wanted to let the lawyer guide the process. Mark would surely try to appeal to my emotions.
I'm sorry. I admit I lied to Daisy and borrowed money from her to give to Mom. But I only did it because I didn't want to see you suffer anymore. I'll pay back every penny to Daisy. So please, reconsider the divorce.
Do you really think that's the only reason? Even I didn't know you were borrowing money from Daisy until that day. So, doesn't it seem strange to you that I could hand her a signed divorce paper on the spot?
Then what's the real reason? Is it, Mom, that's what this is about?
At first, I did blame Florence. I was angry, and I even thought the same thing. That life would be easier without her, but I was wrong. The real enemy was you, Mark. I heard everything. I recounted every word I had overheard outside the room that day. Mark's face turned pale, and I could see the color draining from it as he realized he couldn't make any excuses. Mark attempted to steady himself by drinking coffee, but his hands were trembling so much that he could barely manage it. Do you understand now that avoiding the divorce is not an option?
Then why didn't you tell me sooner?
Mark had a point. After all, nearly a year had passed since that day. That was to finish paying off the mortgage. It makes the divorce proceedings easier, don't you think? Now, what are we going to do about the house?
What do you mean? Mom and I can't just lose our home.
I placed the house deed on the table, and Mark let out a small "oh." He must have searched the entire house for it. I didn't think he had the guts to commit fraud, but I wanted to avoid any chance of him hiding it and dragging out the divorce. That's why I went straight home to retrieve it that day. I worked tirelessly to pay off most of the mortgage, and the house is in my name. But unfortunately, legally, we both have equal ownership, so here's the deal. I'll give you the house, but you need to pay me half of its value up front.
What?
I knew there was no way he could come up with the money, let alone paying up front. That was absolutely impossible. If that's not possible, then I'll take the house. I can pay you half in cash right away.
Where would you even get that kind of money?
My dad gifted it to me before he passed. He wanted to make sure I could live on my own, even after a divorce. The lawyer carefully explained the rules of property division during a divorce, ensuring Mark understood. While the house was subject to division, pre-inheritance gifts were not. As Mark slumped in defeat, I pressed further. And one more thing, I'll be seeking damages from you.
What for? I haven't cheated on you.
That's true. You've always been devoted to Florence, but damages aren't only for infidelity. You've deeply hurt me, and I'm claiming emotional damages.
What?
Was he about to say, "What do you mean by that?" Perhaps worried that saying something unnecessary might increase the damages, Mark swallowed his words. But you don't have any money to pay, do you? After all, you've lost your cash cow. So I'll deduct it from the property division. If you don't agree, feel free to take it to court.
No, that's fine. I understand.
He had no choice but to agree. But if he thought this was the end, he was gravely mistaken. Also, the money you borrowed from Daisy and her husband will be deducted as well.
Wait, that's between me and Daisy.
Do you even have a way to pay it back?
Well, that is.
After yelling in frustration, his tone softened, and he started mumbling. I had met with Daisy after that incident and explained everything to her. I offered to repay the money Mark had lied to borrow from Daisy, but she said, "This is between me and Dad. I'll have him pay it back little by little, but I don't want to see him for a while." Mark likely had no intention nor means to repay the money. For him, being his beloved mother's son always took precedence over being a father. Do you realize how much Daisy has been hurt by this? If you don't repay the money, she'll feel indebted to her husband because of you for the rest of her life. So you'll pay it back, won't you? When I emphasized this, he hung his head in defeat. So here's how it'll be. The damages and the debt are canceled. The house is mine. I'll wire you the money right away. So why not buy something nice for your dear mother? Oh, and you better start looking for a place to live.
Were you planning to deceive me from the beginning? That's a dirty trick.
Oh, says the man who's been deceiving me for 30 years. Mark had no response.
Even so, I don't want a divorce. I've been taking you for granted, but I'll change. Please reconsider.
Why didn't he want to divorce me? Because Mark had already reached retirement age and was currently unemployed. I had been waiting for this moment, coinciding with the completion of the mortgage payments. He wasn't competent by any stretch of the imagination, so reemployment was naturally out of the question. On top of that, he had to support Florence, the ultimate money drain. I laid that reality out for him as well. How foolish. You should have kept it all to yourself and not said a word to Florence. If you had, I wouldn't have had to hear all this nonsense, and you could have kept living comfortably in that house forever. But you outsmarted yourself. That's what they call being hoisted by your own petard. Realizing there was no way out, Mark signed the divorce papers with tears streaming down his face. But I doubt those tears were from sadness. They were likely tears of defeat, something he had never experienced before in his life. However, my revenge didn't end there. About 6 months after my divorce, Mark managed to track down where I lived and came to visit. That house we once shared had been rented out, with other people now living there. I had no intention of living in a place that held nothing but bad memories. Being in a small town, he must have asked around until he finally found me. I had anticipated that Mark would eventually come looking for me. There was still one final lesson to teach him. His thinning bangs were disheveled, and his face glistened with sweat. The once crisp white shirt that suited him so well now clung to his body, damp and unkempt, making him look pitiful. What on earth did I ever see in this man? I couldn't help but laugh.
What's so funny? This is serious. Help me.
Has Florence developed dementia or something?
What?
For the past few years, Florence had shown signs of sporadic memory lapses, almost like early-stage dementia. Whether it was her determination to stay composed in front of her son, or Mark's idealized view of his mother blinding him to the truth, he never seemed to notice. Regardless, she often displayed strange behavior when I was around. She would call me Mom and hand me money, jewelry, or clothes, saying, "Here, this is for you." I recognized it as dementia right away because my grandmother had once shown the same expression, and I knew how to handle it. "Thank you, Florence. You're such a good girl." When I patted her head and said that, Florence nodded happily, like a little girl. My mom used to quietly return whatever my grandmother gave her, but I decided to gratefully accept what Florence handed me. After all, I had been drained financially for so long. What harm could it do?
So all those times Mom was making a fuss about not having money or things.
Exactly. And you've been sneaking money out of my wallet and bill envelopes too, haven't you? Ever since the day I discovered Mark's true nature and vowed revenge, I had been watching him carefully. That's how I caught him secretly taking money. Before that, I used to think, it's Florence again, but I realized that wasn't the case.
Well, that's because Mom.
Florence might be selfish, but she's still a former heiress. She might beg for things, but she'd never stoop to stealing. Mark grimaced like he had just swallowed something bitter. For all her extraordinary selfishness, Florence still had the pride of a former heiress. She was shamelessly direct about what she wanted, but she would never steal or cheat someone out of their money. She hated debt, and when she realized that the mortgage on the house was a form of debt, she would constantly say, "Let's pay it off quickly." When I explained that credit cards were also a type of debt, she immediately stopped using them. Back when I first married into the family, it was Mark who schemed to make me take care of his grandmother. I learned this from the conversation I overheard that day.
I married her to take care of Grandma, you know. Well, then Dad passed away, and that plan went up in smoke.
But I don't like the idea of taking care of someone just for their inheritance.
Hey, we might as well take what we can get.
When I brought this up, a different kind of sweat began to drip down Mark's face.
But I can't handle Mom anymore. She doesn't even recognize me, and she's yelling and hitting me. Please, I'm begging you. Help me.
Florence being unmanageable isn't exactly a new development, is it? I see. So you were planning to use me as a caregiver, weren't you? Unfortunately for you, I only have a certification in care administration, not caregiving. At the mention of this old memory, Mark looked visibly embarrassed. I made sure to tell him everything on my mind before sending him on his way. I've been thinking about dating someone.
It's only been 6 months since our divorce. Were you cheating on me?
No, not at all. He's just asked me out, but he's someone who supported me for a long time. Someone from the same company who's always been there for me. He's honest, hardworking, and sincere. So please, don't involve yourself with me anymore. Mark left, shoulders slumped in defeat. Perhaps he couldn't bear the thought of the woman who had loved him unconditionally now turning her feelings toward someone else. I doubted he would ever come back here again. Mark used the divorce settlement I had given him, along with the money from selling Florence's luxury items, to buy a condo where the two of them lived. Technically, the settlement alone could have covered the cost of the condo, but after subtracting the alimony and repayment to Daisy, the amount he received was significantly reduced. I was surprised Florence had agreed to it, but I heard her behavior had already started becoming erratic by that time. Her dementia symptoms worsened daily, and when Mark could no longer manage, he came to me for help. Or rather, it was more accurate to say that he had no one else to turn to. In the end, he realized that I would only deliver further blows and wouldn't help him. His pride prevented him from seeking assistance from social services. I heard that Florence's bizarre behavior eventually led to complaints from the neighbors. Feeling that he had reached his limit, Mark sold the condo and used the proceeds to place Florence in a private nursing home. It seems that until the very end, Mark's life was dictated by money, all for Florence's sake. The once envied, elegant family had now become the subject of hushed whispers whenever they walked outside. Unable to endure the shame, Mark moved into a cheap apartment in a neighboring town, living quietly. He had no jobs, no friends, no relatives, and no family. Even the mother he had adored no longer recognized him. He would likely live the rest of his life burdened by loneliness, poverty, and countless regrets. As for me, I decided to accept the proposal of the man who had asked me out. He was someone I had joined the company with, who had since been promoted to an executive role. A workaholic who had missed his chance to marry. I was surprised to learn he had been watching over me all this time. Given our age, we decided not to focus on marriage, but to start as companions who could enjoy tea together. Not long after, I received the happy news that Daisy was expecting her second child. My granddaughter Emma was thrilled to become a big sister. Daisy and her husband suggested that I live with them, but I gratefully declined their offer. My parents also asked me to come back home, but I politely turned them down as well. With rental income coming in, I have no worries about money. From now on, I want to work for myself and embark on a new chapter of life dedicated to my own happiness.